So Carlos and Alex and colleagues on this call who made contributions to the special issue on Paulo Freire, Global Educator, that has come out most recently from the journal Globalisation, Societies and Education, of which I'm one of the founding editors, but also currently co-editor with Mario Novelli. And it was so wonderful to be able to see this special issue take root and begin to flourish, and now it's out there speaking to the wider world. Alex, I'm wondering, can you give us a little bit of a background to the Paulo Freire event and the wider work of CLAREC that you might be able to also enlighten us a little bit on, and in that way we'll be able to have a bit of a sense of what the history of this venture and adventure has been.
Okay. Hi everyone. And the idea of this special edition arose during the celebration of the centenary of Paulo Freire's birth and the collaborations and relationships that evolved from an initiative that took place at the University of Cambridge in 2021. Just a year early, in 2020, a group of students that me, Rocío, Paula, and Juliana are part, doctoral students and master students at the Faculty of Education, Cambridge, formed a collective with the aim of creating a dedicated space to promote Latin America perspective at that institution. So this collective that we call CLAREC brought together students and researchers working in Latin American contexts. So we saw it was a very timely to promote a series of academic and cultural initiatives, activities to stimulate discussions around Freire's work. So this celebration Cambridge was collaborative effort, involved not only members of our collective, but also the Faculty of Education community, or the collectives and social movements. The three editors, as you said, Susan, of this special issue, you, Carlos, and I were involved in this initiative. So in the introduction of this special edition, we tell a bit more about this story.
It's wonderful, Alex, and it was then such an honor to be able to host Carlos. I'm sure no one needs to introduce Carlos, but let me just say this, that Carlos, much of your life's work has been an ongoing series of engagements in very productive, very personal, but also very creative ways. Can you say something from your point of view, Carlos, about Freire's kind of legacy and what you think yourself, what his legacy is?
Thank you, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here. It was a pleasure to collaborate in this project. One day I asked Paulo, and I said to him in one of my many interviews, he always said that I was the one that interviewed him the most over his lifetime. I asked him, how do you want to be remembered? And he was very specific. He said, as somebody who lived, loved, and wanted to know. And I found that a very consistent Freirean statement. Now, my take on Freire is that he was really a pioneer from Latin America, and a pioneer epistemologically, and a pioneer in methodological terms. What do I mean by a pioneer? until Freire and many other people that came up in Latin America with a critique of the dominance of the Anglo-Saxon science, we didn't have many people who symbolize alternative. And the alternative that he symbolized is not only with pedagogy of the oppressed, but also with the question of this epistemological concept that every social relationships involves a model of domination and oppression. Then the other element that I think it was crucial in his career and in his contribution was on models of research, methods of research, or participatory action research. And I think he is one of the great contributors to this model of participatory action research, which had already been initiated to some extent by the same time in Tanzania, with the presence of some Norwegian researchers and so on. But Freire, actually, they gave a different perspective. Having said that, I think that Freire, how I remember Freire and what I think Freire needs to be considered. Number one, I think, is that from as analytical or scholarship model, Freire was somebody who matched the reputation and contributions of somebody like Dewey. In that regard, gave us an alternative to a traditional Anglo-Saxon model. In addition to that, he gave people a language. When you really look at the conversation about politicity in Freire, or if you really look at how you connect the different models of epistemology that he was trying to confront, etc., he gave people a language to express feelings of trying to avoid a culture of silence, but also, in addition to that, a framework which was pretty close to the UNESCO humanistic framework, but it was in itself a very different perspective. At the level of image, he was a kind of a prophet of social transformation. He has a face of a prophet. He got absolutely overtaken by the moment of speaking with people, to people, in a short, small group or in a large group. So I think that element of prophecy he actually used in his writings, and I concluded my book, my main book on Freire with that sentence was about who are the prophets. And I think it really inspirational. But then at another level, we'll say the intimacy of knowledge. He connected with people in ways that I didn't see before. And I've been in this business for more than 4 decades. I remember one day there was a meeting to all the left in New York put together a meeting to celebrate one of Freire's birthday, and we were there, and I was invited, etc. And the culmination of that process was Freire giving a small lecture in an auditorium that was absolutely full. And he gave a typical lecture of Freire, very emotional, very solid, analytical. Very strange combination, right? And one of the things that I noticed, I arrived much earlier, so I was sitting in the first or second row. He looked at me, he knew me, of course, and he was talking to me. So essentially, this individual was giving a lecture in celebration of his birthday and had a friend, and he was saying, you know, Carlos, you know, Carlos, you know, Carlos, and everybody was asking, who is this Carlos, of course. But at some point, the thing didn't go well, because after he finished, the first person that stood up was an American person who accused him of being an oppressor because he was using words. This man who was just recently educated, let me put it this way, or have access to literacy training, whatever it was, I was accusing Freire that he couldn't understand what he was saying because he used these difficult concepts or words. Freire was so offended, he walked away out of the place and disappeared. So I went with him. So we sat in a taxi to go to the hotel. We were in the same hotel. And then he was really very upset. And then he looked at me and said the following: "You know, Carlos, I can be a populist like any other person. But when I told him that if he did not understand my words, he should go to the dictionary, that's what I had to do." And then didn't say one more word in the rest of the trip. So that shows that he was a person that becoming almost an icon, a legend by the time he was in his mid-40s, late 40s. He never took that to oppress him, making him to act in ways that will affect his personal approach to people and personal approach to scholarship. So in synthesis, how I see him, I said already, so as an alternative to the Anglo-Saxon tradition, as an alternative to the epistemology of the North, as a language that allows us to convey our deepest feelings of oppression, and the world continues to be very difficult as it is now, as it was before, but also as a human being with whom I could communicate and talk to him in ways that I haven't had this opportunity with so many scholars. And my last comment will be his actual, no, I wouldn't say humility, but respect. I think Freire was somebody who showed that when we teach, we have to have respect for our students. And at some point, in a meeting that we had in a university in Sao Paulo, there was a small group of people. I was there with Paulo, went with Paulo. And at some point, everybody was asking him questions. So I asked one question and I said, "Look, you have been very close to the notion of popular culture. But we know that popular cultures have great elements of alienation, because if you really look very carefully to the model of Freire, it's not that different than critical theory. And alienation is a concept that have percolated throughout the tradition of critical theory, like Frankfurt, Freire, etc. So I actually posed the question to Freire, and Freire ignored completely the question. Why? Because if he addressed the question, he should have criticized popular culture. He was not going to do it. And I understood. I didn't get upset at all. That was his way to tell me and everybody else, you sit on a fence, and if you fall on one side, then essentially that's what you are.
That's a wonderful legacy. And I think, Carlos, thinking about lived, loved, and wanted to know, actually, if we can draw that forward into the contemporary moment, with all the turbulence in the world, that in fact some of those sentiments would go some distance to enabling us to hear each other. Can I turn over to you, Rocío? You've got a wonderful paper, and you pick up a particular concept in your paper around politicity. So just tell us what kind of insight does that kind of concept from Freire kind of give you and give the reader, potentially, to help us, really make that strong claim around Freire as global educator?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very interesting question, because politicity appears throughout most of Freire's work. As Carlos just said, like, it's a central concept of his work, but it wasn't necessarily as developed at least not explicitly from the Freirean tradition as much as other concepts. But I argue that politicity can actually offer many insights because it's basically asking where does our political condition and the political nature of education comes from, like concretely, right, epistemologically and ontologically. So this implies to go beyond the moral and value-oriented claims. And this is not to say that these claims are not relevant or that we shouldn't be making them, on the contrary, but it's about looking further beyond. And basically, it's looking to the essence of what being humans is about. It has to do with our relation as humans to the world in its structural, cultural, and agential dimensions. And this relation is basically mutually constitutive and in constant motion. So it involves ideas, it involves imaginaries, which is something I pay particular attention in the paper. And throughout the paper, I argue that this imaginative exercise of envisioning new realities, for example, during the strike processes, is also an echo of our own positionality. So it actually helps us to understand what are the structures, what are the culture in which we are situated in concrete, where we are part of, and therefore under which change can take place or not. What are the possibilities, what are the particular limits of change, and how we can, as agents, how we can overcome them. So basically, in the paper, I develop politicity as a lens, not just as a noun, but as a lens to analyze what are the possibilities in a determined juncture. And I look in particular at a teacher strike in Chile that took place 4 or 5 years ago. And I analyze what are we fighting against, right? I think politicity is about looking in a much more detailed and robust way. What are these structures and cultural elements that we need to understand much better to defy them? So I also like from the concept of politicity that it brings attention to questioning in which or how do we get to know things? Where does our knowledge come from? Because Freire also posted the attention to questioning hegemonic knowledge and also because of this relationship with the world as humankind, we will very rarely can overcome these structures just by relying in the hegemonic knowledge that has been produced and perpetuated these structures, right? Yeah, I think those are some of the main insights of the concepts.
And I can see, you pushing people back into also reading more systematically the work of Freire. Paula, can we go over to you? And you worked with your colleague Leila, and you had two kind of concerns that you were bringing together. One, a historic concern around the quality of teachers and so on, and then the possibilities of using things like lesson study and so on. Can you just share with us a little bit something of the process of working with another colleague, but also what you think the key conclusions in your paper were?
Yeah, when I first got to know lesson study, which is a methodology that enables teacher to go deeper on their tacit knowledge or things that they don't know they know and they practice, it reminded me immediately of some of key concepts of Paulo Freire, especially the dialogicity and the consciousness of reality. So I first started working with this methodology because I understand is one of the approaches that will best link elements that will really draw into teachers' learning from a different perspective, different from what is traditionally known in education. And because I believe that teachers are the main element if we want to improve, change any educational system. So especially in Brazil, that in my paper I talk a little bit about this. that what we have today is not only results from this colonized perspective of education that we lived through during centuries, and we still see in the classroom, we still see teachers submissive to a prescribed curriculum, but also not only the historical perspective, but also the bad educational policies that we had. We suffered a lot in Brazil in the last government, which we had 5 different ministries of education in one period, and much of the work that was that took roots in the public system, especially for elementary school, it was erased, basically, the work of Freire. So I believe we need to have strategies to go back to that in Brazil, and I believe one of the ways is through professional development. And I could see that lesson study was a way of, and a strategy to operationalize, to make it materialized, and in a systematic way. Very important concepts that Freire advocate, like collaboration. How we say that, what we see a lot in Brazil is that we know a lot of Freire's words and concepts, but it's hard to implement in the classroom. So I believe lesson studies share these concepts as collaboration, dialogue, respect, as Carlos said. And there's one that I really like, that is amorosity. It's hard to translate into English. Will be something about loving, is this very abstract, but at the same time concrete element, if I can say that, of that involves the willingness that the teacher has to want to improve. So I believe that putting this Paulo Freire's framework of these key concepts together with a methodology that came from Japan, right, over 150 years ago, it's possible, and it's a strategy to make his thoughts, his thinking come to the classroom itself. And
that's beautifully put. That's beautifully put, and that sense, the idea of amorosity, I think, is so important. Shall I go across to you, Juliana, because you've done a wonderful paper where you're taking some of the work around the theatre of the oppressed, which was stimulated by Freire's lenses. Can you talk to us about what that paper looks like? So if we were to read the paper, what are you talking about in this paper? What are you exploring?
I'm exploring how we can use theater as a tool for social change. And then today I would like to also go through the perspective of public pedagogy, because I also talk about this. And then if we think about the public pedagogy, if it refers to educational practice that extend beyond educational settings, I explored applied theater, which also goes beyond the formal theatrical settings, keeping in mind Freire's concept of educational as a tool to question and change realities. So for illustrate that, I used the work of Estopo Balaio. This is a Brazilian theater group. They had collaborated with a neighborhood in Brazil for over 10 years, using memory and narrative as pedagogical tools. And for example, Estopo Balaio, it captures the lived experience of the community through narratives of floods, because this neighborhood, they were under flood for 3 months in 2010, for example. So those narratives were rehearsed and performed by locals in the streets and houses in the neighborhood. And then it served as a medium to challenge preconceived notions and encourage residents to reconsider social conditions. And it allies to Freire's emphasis on literacy, extending beyond decoding words to understand power dynamics and social structures.
A beautiful piece too, and I was really taken when I was reading it. Alex, and Carlos, some of our colleagues are not on this on this kind of call, as it were. And do you want to say one or two things, Alex, about the many of the pieces? There are many open access. So back to you, Alex.
Thank you, Susie. The special issue is now available on the journal's website, as described on the screen. It's a collection of 12 papers, including the introduction, with half of them being open access. The first article is an inspiring contribution by Carlos titled Paulo Freire, a thinker of praxis, an itinerant thinker, a universal thinker, following that Peter Mayo portrays Freire as a global luminary in education in his test. And also, Kathryn Miller's powerful test is part of her speech as a keynote speaker at the Freire conference we have mentioned. And there is also tests by Massimiliano Tarozzi, who ventures into reinventing Freire in the Italian context, and the test is by José Beltrán-Llavador, reflect on praxis of hope. As mentioned, there is a test I wrote in collaboration with Rosana Fernandes from the MST, and the test authored by Rocío. Additionally, the concept of dialogue and critical consciousness comes to the forefront in the paper by Wen Xu and Kathryn Stahl. And as commented on here, there are also papers authored by Juliana and Paula and their respective collaborators. And this fantastic collection ends with a paper authored by 4 academic human and militants of popular education in Brazil, Joana Salem, Naiara Rosário, Tatiane Ribeiro, and Paula Maíra Cordeiro, in which they discuss popular knowledge as popular power. Over to you, Susan.
I'm wondering if, as we draw this to a close, can everyone just think of one word? There's some words that we've heard already. But if you were to put it in one word, when you think of Freire as global educator, what might that word be? Carlos, shall I go over to you, then across to Alex? Carlos, what's your one word?
Well, I will say sensei, because a sensei is a teacher to whom we have a depth that is impossible to repay.
Fantastic. Rocío, what's your one word?
I think I would say creativity, because we need to be creative in order to think about new possibilities, in order to read the world, to innovate theoretically and methodologically. And I think that's what he did most of his life. So creativity.
Juliana, what's your one word?
Democratization.
Fantastic. And to you, Paula.
Yeah, I'll think of conscientization, because what's behind is what we really need to find out. So I think it's a good one.
So it's a well-known, and it is definitely a global concept. Alex, back over to you. One word, or even you could have the one word and the last word.
I love the word inédito viável, which is untested feasibility. Is a way to guide us in possible transformations, alternatives for reality. So it's my word.
And we had other words, didn't we? Amorosity, the idea of the profit, generosity, and so on. So, colleagues, we'll conclude this. So I'm just going to turn the recording